To give you some background, this is not necessarily, this is an emerging discussion that we're engaging with that is actually quite moment specific for the UK context, as it looks at kind of the changing or the consolidation rather of perception of design and architecture through the context of architectural practice and education. So both myself and Matt come from, yes, a design-led practice, research practice background. I myself am very interested in notions of convention and the way that they kind of engage with the necessity for a kind of mode of divergent thinking to emerge in architectural practice. And at the same time, Matt is very interested in aspects of divergence and convergence in a very different way than that Michael introduced in the first talk of this, the first keynote talk. But I will jump to the text, so don't delay anymore. So architecture has consistently occupied the interstice. Awkwardly, it has been situated between creative thinking and technological endeavor, between humanistic values and scientific fact. So it is in a crisis of identity, in a kind of constant state of redefining its identity over the years. The architectural discipline has, as Catherine Ingram described, operated with an agenda of appropriation, presenting itself as a cultural and operational magpie. In her book, Architecture and the Burdens of Linearity, which draws from a wider post-structuralist discourse and looks at notions of propriety, integrity, inheritance, and by extent, definition of architecture and as a discipline. Ingram carefully navigates architecture's inherent need to operate through difference and the process of movement in stasis, while tiptoeing on the doubling of linearity as a device of disciplining order and an evolutionary line of heritage, as well as the doubling of discipline as a definitive canon and a form of creative authority. Architecture's practice has indeed relied on the establishment of larger representational convention that finds its culmination in the linear recoding of the world as a spatial condition. We see here examples not from the L'Architettura, sorry Nick, but from the La Pittura of Leon Battista Alberti, but a kind of originary reference for architecture's linear way of perceiving the world. And at the other side, from the American notebook that Adolfo Natalini was drawing during his travels for the MoMA exhibition in New York in 1972, his representation of himself or the architect as Mickey canonizing Salt Lake by means of a grid and eventually getting lost within it himself. So as old as this convention is, it has managed to fit the shifting epistemological paradigms of differing periods. It has moved from classicist order to modernist rationalism and post-structuralist difference, with an apparent consistency that maintains its architectural quality. This diversity with which the architectural methods of survey or representation and redeployment or design of the world have adapted while maintaining an architectural integrity, in Ingram's words, demonstrate that the notion of malleability and inclusivity is indeed embedded and inherent within architecture's disciplinary core. To briefly showcase the adaptability and diversification of architecture towards the world over the past 50 years, and as it has been articulated in the kind of area that we're interested in, which is that of the tools of representation, the tools of capturing, of making sense of the world before applying intent. These are only very few examples of site and context-specific architectural praxis, translating and revealing how not only formal, geometric, but also natural, cultural, and social specificities enter the field of visibility, and by extent, the field of design and action of the architect. So on one hand, here we see different iterations of very clear linear modes of representation that begin to tap into areas of daily life and the environment that are commonly excluded from older conventional understandings of what we see as architectural drawing. And the same here, perhaps in examples that are less about survey and more about process of creative thinking. So we have OMA's articulation of program as landscape in Parc de la Villette, Perry Calper's drawing by means of digital modeling, so perceiving digital modeling and fabricating digital modeling as drawing, as planar drawing in the specific occasion. Medi's reading and refolding of Ottawa in the microurbanism project. And of course, something that perhaps becomes more representational of a post-structuralist, mostly representative of a post-structuralist discourse and practice in architecture, Daniel Libeskind's reorganizing of Berlin for Potsdamer Platz. Sorry, this is not moving. Today we would like to begin to look at how this movement in stasis of architecture is accommodated or not within regulatory schemes in the particular context of the United Kingdom. Architectural practice and education are in this country very clearly defined by disciplining bodies, the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, and the Architectural Registration Board, ARB. These are long-standing institutions that unavoidably set up a well-defined interface between architectural production and inevitably thought and its users or audience. As such, they define expectation and demand through a constant feedback cycle between industry, practice, and educational pathways. As is expected, such regulatory bodies are more concerned with establishing a minimum standard, that is normal, for the qualification and validation of architectural designers and their architectural products. Yet, despite their minimum threshold, we would like to underline that these criteria seem to become increasingly definitive of the discipline and eventually exclusive of difference and creative thinking. What we would like to address today then is how such regulatory criteria acquire a leading rather than safeguarding role within education and practice, how they are increasingly used as paradigmatic beacons of convergence in the sense that, I can't remember his first name, Lawson talks about, Brian Lawson, frames are the thinking habitus of the designer in the margin of between divergence and convergence, whereby convergence is not necessarily about the coming together, but it's also about the fixing, about the kind of narrowing down rather than opening up. So for the purposes of this presentation, we will be only looking quite briefly at two documents, the RIBA Procedures for Validation, which is defined as not only for UK, but also for international course architecture, because this is something we export, dating in 2021. And the ARB criteria at parts 1, 2, and 3, which is effective from 2011 and is currently undergoing radical review. So of course, we are also in a moment, like I said, that is an opportunity for anticipation and consideration, although I will argue that the public consultation has been quite limited to a specific group of the public, which is the registered architects that had the time to go in and contribute to the consultation. So looking at this document of the ARB first, the ARB criteria at parts 1, 2, and 3, under the Architects Act in 1997, the Architects Registration Board has the responsibility for prescribing the qualifications and practical experience required for entry onto the UK Register of Architects. So this is serious stuff about what it is to be an architect, or rather to be called an architect in the UK. So currently, the criteria for parts 1 and 2 are still in alignment with the kind of European community guides. However, part 3, which is the stage that actually gives you the title of the architect, is a more esoteric UK condition. So I don't know how clear this is, I'm sorry about that, because it's a screenshot from a PDF. The general criteria, part 1 and part 2, suggest that the graduate needs to have ability to create architectural designs that satisfy both aesthetic and technical requirements. And understanding, and please notice that the ability, the understanding, or later the idea of skill, define different levels of knowledge. Of the need to relate buildings and spaces between them to human needs and scale, understanding of the role of the architect in society, the necessary design skills to meet building users' requirements, adequate knowledge of industries involved in translating design concepts into buildings, and in terms of the graduate attributes for part 1, the ability to generate design proposals while recognizing the boundaries of professional practice and the academic discipline of architecture. So interesting, there's an aspect of academic intent and agenda coming in there that is other to that of the professional practice. And for part 2, the ability to generate complex design proposals with originality in the application of subject knowledge, hypothesis, with new hypotheses and speculation. So that's where we begin to have suggestions of divergence as well. So elements of context and user specificity are here mentioned against the minimum threshold of need or necessity of understanding, but not necessarily doing or making, and translating into the final building product within the constraints imposed by cost factors and building regulation. Aspects of originality, hypothesis, and speculation, which more directly address elements of alterity and inclusivity in terms of the outcome, the context, or the intent, are at this stage more directly confronted with the, aspects of originality, hypothesis, and speculation, which more directly address elements of alterity and inclusivity within design as a creative and productive process, interestingly, make a more direct appearance in the part 2 graduate attributes. However, such values are at this stage more directly confronted. We know, you would know if you are teaching, which most of you are, at stage of part 2 are more strictly confronted with the building regulations approved documents, which constitute statutory guidelines for the construction of buildings as functional and safe products. Again, setting up minimum thresholds for what is the least tolerable, essentially, outcome. Sorry, I skipped the part 1 and part 2. That's why I was talking, you didn't know what I was saying. Sorry. I'll jump straight to part 3. For part 3, the stage that offers the definitive title, but not necessarily function, as in fact, the actual design process can be carried out by literally anyone, and it is a protected title rather than a function that we're talking about here. The requirements, quote, are specific UK requirements for registration, and the 5 professional criteria are not fully derived from the EU directive. This focus on aspects of ethics, particularly as a means of safeguarding limited liability, and this is only one of the sections. You see, this is professional criteria 4, but I wanted I couldn't show you all, but I want to show you this one. So this focus on aspects of ethics, particularly as a means of safeguarding limited liability, legal and market-oriented understandings of clients rather than users, and other legal components of production process that safeguard intellectual property and industrial efficiency. Specifically, according to PC4, which we see here, a successful candidate will be able to demonstrate understanding of the business priorities, required management processes, and risks of running an architecture practice and the relationship between the practice of architecture and the UK construction industry. So this is a language that is a language of convergence, that is a language of regulation, as is expected, perhaps from a document that is about validation, but this is a document that, despite setting these minimum grounds, in fact, is becoming more and more of a leading document for what architectural education and, by consequence, practice is. So, moving on to the RIBA, today we will look and we will discuss at the validation procedures rather than more complex learning analysis of the learning outcomes that the RIBA prescribes. Pages 9, 10, and 11 of the document for the process of validation of an accredited school more bluntly set the tone, presenting the themes and values that RIBA pursues for architectural education. And it's interesting to see the use of the word value in particular here. These move more and more away from ideas of originality, creativity, and alterity that perhaps were more openly hinted at in the ARB content. Aspects of inclusivity, are made aspects of inclusivity are here made present through awareness of statutory frameworks that relate to health and safety, professional practice, climate literacy, and business skills as critical buzzwords for the execution of architecture as a product-oriented discipline, whereby user environment are perceived through the minimum standards of regulation and liability protection. Points 4 and 5, out of the themes and values for architectural education, gather quickly the soft parts of architectural education clustered under terms such as history, theory, and architectural expression, finally introducing only 1/6 of the whole description, the notions of spatiality and synthesis for the first time. These are, in the graduate attributes, vaguely defined on the right-hand side of the page. Once more, in non-architectural or spatial terms, drawing on deterministic and positive terms that are familiar to a kind of more acceptable, easily tangible form of knowledge, such as, drawing on deterministic positive terms such as problem solving, evaluation, evidence, not failing to mention the climate emergency as a particularity rather than a kind of inherent integral subject. Overall, we can see that only 2 out of 6 themes or values, to also make this a very pragmatic ratio form of analysis, become explicitly defined in architectural terms, that is, in terms that recognize an architectural epistemological authority. Likewise, in the part 2 graduate attributes at the bottom of the page, the elements concerned with an architectural mode of knowledge production and by extent with an architectural praxis or mode of operation are carefully balanced by the rules of engagement that bypass architectural design. So if the ARB manages to somewhat still defend the creative dimension of architecture, both documents are clearly tentative in engaging with the concept of architecture and architectural design as an epistemological field. They're there to tame it, to control it, to make it other. You know, it's meant to be like that. Okay. No worries. So you can listen to me. Rather than a critical magpie capable of collecting and appropriating environments, and to a degree acting as that interface of coming together of these diverse tools that it's capable of appropriating and making use of. Architecture emerges out of these documents more like a frivolous aesthetic that needs to be disciplined and validated through safe professional application and positivist rationalism. The documents are as self-referential as much as they present architecture as a field requiring definition from the outside. The architecture of these documents barely responds to Nicholas Pevster's statement, a bicycle said is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture, which recognize the intangible and uncountable complexity of the latter against mere construction. But what is more clearly emerging is a disregard for other pieces of architecture. The documents promise and safeguard the efficiency of the product, not achieving to safeguard the productivity of the operation beyond and before the output. What is missing is the recognition of architecture as a creative praxis of knowledge production, which is defined not by tools and methods, but by its ability to create new tools and special lenses for framing the world. So to frame this idea of praxis, oh no, we don't want the sound. To frame the idea of praxis that I'm talking about here, that we are talking about here with Matt, we must consider not only the outputs, but also the habitus of the architect. So this idea that practice is not only industrial practice, the practice that is contextualized in a market value, but also one that has to do with the habit of action and practice, of doing and making, as consisting of schemes, in Bourdieu's terms, or constellations of existing and emerging design permutations that provide a network of options for a designer to navigate through practice. As Bourdieu suggests, these schemes alone cannot be defined for practice because they do not represent a static position and therefore involve a degree of uncertainty, opaqueness, and fuzziness. Rather than drawing analogies with the fixed patterns of stars in the night sky, because you use specifically the term constellation, the constellation here allows us to interrogate architectural design as a dynamic and continually diverging and converging formation that oscillates between these two conditions, more akin to the murmurations of starlings before dusk. So as the ARB criteria have recently... I cannot move past this slide.
I think you can need to press 2 or 3 times.
Well, it's not very exciting. This is where I wanted to go. But just to finish, I am finishing. So as the ERB criteria have recently undergone a semi-public consultation, emerging changes seem to have a twofold direction. On one hand, we have seen apprenticeship schemes becoming established within UK architectural education in a move that favors even more the idea of the minimum standard and of architecture as a practical process rather than creative praxis. On the other hand, the promise for inclusivity is expected to offer alternative pathways that converge to the ARB, RIBA axis only in the latter stages, so we can have people coming into architectural education with first degrees in other fields. This can be a great opportunity, as long as it does not become one more crutch for the external propping and therefore reduction of the value of architectural creativity. Thank you very much.